Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media. The mainstream media and international community have largely ignored the atrocities and genocide that is going on in my home country of South Africa. As economic refugees living abroad, we as independent media fight to expose the truth and find solutions for the many suffering and impoverished people still stuck in South Africa. This is Stop South African Genocide, hosted by Mel V and Karin Smith, live on CCN.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Mel V, coming to you live from Conscious Consumer Network headquarters here in Portugal. It is great to be with you all again for our scheduled broadcast of Stop South African Genocide. First off, a big hello to my most esteemed co-host, Karin Smith. It's always great to have you with us. And our guest for this evening, Dr. Peter Hammond. Dr. Hammond, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've been very, very busy, and we are very honored that you could share some time with us.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I think let's just jump straight into it. I'm very fascinated by you and some of your perspectives. And before I kind of get into the juicy stuff, I really want to ask you a little bit, a brief background for those people who don't know you, who are in our audience and who've not come across your work before.
Thank you. I'm a Christian missionary, born in Cape Town, South Africa, raised in Bulawayo in Madabila land, Rhodesia, what today is Zimbabwe. My father was a veteran of the Second World War, all 6 years of the Second World War in the Royal Artillery in the 8th Army, mostly under Montgomery, fighting in North Africa and El Alamein and Italy. He then became a hotel manager in Rhodesia, and even was running the catering at the Victoria Falls Hotel when the royal family visited in 1947. My father said the most terrifying experience in his life was catering for the royal family, more frightening than being bombed by the Afrika Korps in North Africa during the World War. Obviously, my dad, being a serious colonial, took responsibilities of catering for the royal family super seriously. And it was just a privilege and a pleasure and a joy growing up in Rhodesia. I had a lion cub, Vivian, as my pet. I met Joy Adamson when I was just 6 years old, and I've got all of her books, signed books, Born Free, Living Free. I was brought up around wildlife. I had a bush baby as a pet when I was in the army, and when I came out of the army, I had this bush baby in my pocket as I hitchhiked around the country. I was too young for the Rhodesian War. My brother fought in the Rhodesian Army, but I fought in the South African Defence Force, South African Infantry, 1979 to 81 National Service, and then for the next 10 years, call-ups 2-3 months a year for the next 10 years. But I was converted to Christ in 1977 at age 17 and called into missions. And so straight after my experiences in the South African military, I was going into Mozambique and into Angola. And I've been for 35 years a missionary to persecuted Christians. So I've worked as far afield in 36 countries across 4 continents. I've ministered behind the Iron Curtain and behind the Berlin Wall back in the 1980s, smuggling into Checkpoint Charlie, into East Berlin, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania. And I ministered throughout Mozambique and Angola in the heavy war years of the 80s and up into Rwanda during the Holocaust. In Rwanda, I've written the Holocaust Rwanda book. In Sudan, I've been involved since 1995 and conducted 27 missions, over 1,200 services and meetings in Sudan during the war, both South Sudan and the Nuba Mountains of Central Sudan, kind of an island of Christianity in a sea of Islam. I've ministered in the Congo, Zimbabwe. I've been arrested in these countries. I've been imprisoned in Zambia, Mozambique, arrested, interrogated in Zimbabwe, and also locked up in Sudan, and strafed and bombed a few times, including in Sudan, and ambushed in Mozambique. So we've had all kinds of experiences. So I come to this not from the traditional perspective. My father was a colonial. I was brought up in Rhodesia. I am South African born. I've served in the South African Army. but I've been for 35 years a missionary to persecuted Christians throughout Africa and Eastern Europe. And that's really my background. I love animals. I love to read. I love mountain climbing. I'm an avid marksman. I love shooting as well. I do everything from archery to sword fighting to long distance marksmanship with rifles, and I combat shooting as well is one of my sports. So I'm a father of 4 children. I've got 2 daughters, 2 sons who I have home educated. We've homeschooled right from the beginning, and we live in Cape Town. I'm based in South Africa and travel around the country. So there's probably not a town or village in South Africa that I haven't traveled through and probably ministered in over the last years. And I could say the same for Southwest Africa, Namibia. I could say the same for Zimbabwe. For most of Zambia, I could say that. For a lot of Mozambique and Angola, and for all of South Sudan, there's few places I haven't been in those countries. Those have been my main areas of work.
Wow, that's very impressive. I just find, I did listen to part of your interview where you said that you had actually been imprisoned and suffered some abuse during your time doing what you do. And that's obviously interesting because, you know, it seems that those people who are doing good work seem to be becoming victims of the sort of thing more and more these days.
It is. It's part of the occupational hazard, really. We've got to expect that we're going to be hammered, and I see a lot of what's going on today prophetically warned about in George Orwell's 1984, where he spoke about the thought police, and he spoke about the Ministry of Love dealing with torture, and a Ministry of Peace dealing with war, and a Ministry of Plenty dealing with rationing and starvation, and a Ministry of Truth dealing in lies and propaganda. I think that's where we are. We're seeing George Orwellian vision of 1984, where you and I can say the most obvious, natural, axiomatic truth, and it's called a thought crime because they don't like people speaking truth. So I've found that getting locked up and getting abused and getting beaten and having people sending you death threats, and I've got a huge file. In fact, a lot of files now, because no one file can hold it, of just death threats and abusive letters. And we've gotten a wide range of threats, and I've got death threats from governments, even Mozambique government, Zimbabwe government, and the Sudan government have all sent me death threats and have even publicly announced, as for example, the governor of Sudan, that if I come into Sudan, I should expect to be bombed every time I come to Sudan. I should expect to be shot on sight because my writing would make me an enemy of the state. And the Mozambique Ministry of Justice sent me a letter on letterhead telling me if I come back to Mozambique, they're going to kill me. They didn't like the book I'd written about them either. So it seems that truth is a real weapon, and there's a lot of people afraid of it.
Yes. So true. I myself am a banned author, so I totally get this. My book has not disallowed me from re-entering South Africa. So it's lovely to chat to you. I understand what a humble space you've got to work from when you are constantly faced with these threats, because being a purveyor of truth, and it's it's a calling. It's a special duty that you feel. Be it from a religious space or, your just a sheer sense of connection to humanity that, or perhaps a deep indignation at the injustice that we see playing out every day. It's something that calls each people like Karin and I and yourself to do this sort of thing, irrespective of the various perils that get foisted upon us. I'm very interested to hear your opinion about what's going on in South Africa and where, some of the more controversial things you've been involved with and exposing in South Africa.
Yes. The middle letter of cancer is ANC. We know what a cancer is. My wife is a cancer survivor. She's twice gone through cancer, and that's the whole thing. She knows the surgery, the chemotherapy, the radiation, hormone treatments, all the horrible things. And personally, I think it's one big racket, and it's obnoxious. I think that the poisoning and mutilating and burning of patients, cancer treatments become an industry. And my wife's convinced she's never going to go that way again because we've had enough of it. But a cancer is a cell in your body that does not contribute to the health of the body. It does not do its job. It breaks down and erodes and undermines all the other cells of the body, ultimately destroys the health and kills the victim, the host. And that's what the ANC are. The abortion, nepotism, and corruption party, or the abortion, necklacing, and communism party, however you like to call the ANC. I call them the cancer because that's it, you know, small c, capital ANC, and then a small ER. That's what we're dealing with. And they are so corrupt. They are so incompetent. They are so evil. A British economist said recently that there's not enough intelligence amongst the entire ANC to run a small town. And I think he's being too kind and too generous. They are a pack of criminals. They are a bunch of, to call them a mafia, a black mafia, would be to insult the mafia in Italy, because they are worse. These people are murderers, thieves, liars, and all they've got going for them is the myth and the lie of apartheid and colonialism, and they keep milking this disinformation campaign for all it's worth to enable him to get away with looting, raping, and pillaging the entire country. And what's at stake here is not just whites who are being murdered at a tremendous rate and tortured in the most hideous way, but what's at stake here is civilization itself on the African continent. They are seeking to wipe out every vestige of civilization on this continent. And we in Cape Town feel like we're the last toehold of Western Christian civilization at the edge of the dark continent. And we are holding on for all we're worth, and we'd like to secede and create a Cape of Good Hope Republic. And that's one of our goals, of course, because the rest of the country is going down like the Titanic. And we like one of the lifeboats that needs to launch out and help others, of course. We want to be good neighbors. But first of all, if your aircraft has decompression, you must put your oxygen mask over your own self first before attempting to assist other passengers, because you can't help anyone if you're unconscious. And in the same way, we don't see how we can continue to help people in the rest of the country unless we break free and are an independent state. And the Cape has, of course, a long history. We've been around for 360 years plus. The Zulus were celebrating 200 years anniversary last year, and, you know, good for them. But we've been going for almost double the amount of time, and nobody questions the Zulus' right to be a nation. But somehow we in the Cape of Good Hope are having our birthright denied to us, and we are being made a minority in our own country.
Karin, do you want to jump in here?
Dr. Hammond, yes, we were the ones that broadcast the secession of the Khoi King. And if we had not done that, there would have been no public knowledge of it whatsoever. So we are firmly behind the secession of the Cape. I hate the word safe space because it has horrible connotations nowadays, but the people of South Africa need a safe space where they can rescue their language, their culture, their heritage from this genocide that it's undergone over the last 22 years, and put back in place a prosperous, well-run country for them to live in. Now, they don't need the gold and diamonds because King Kubaha says you can't eat those. They need food. They need food security. They need farmers who are not secure in South Africa. And I'm so glad to hear that you back this, because so many people are sitting on the fence. They'll jump one way if it succeeds and the other way if it doesn't. We need people to back it, to make it succeed. You can't sit on the fence and pray that someone else is going to do this.
No, indeed. And I've traveled widely enough across 36 countries to know that this is the way it's got to go. In Sudan, where I've done a lot of work, we were major advocates of the secession of South Sudan because I could see that there was no way that there was any future for black Christians in a country where they were a minority, or where the Muslim Arabs were imposing Sharia law, and this basically was essential. In South Sudan, when I was speaking about the leaders of South Sudan, meaning Colonel John Garang, did not believe it was possible. And I was advocating, promoting, and he is thinking, well, we're hoping for autonomy in federal Sudan. And I said, that's not going to work either. In the end, they were surprised. Commander Salva Kiir, who's now the president of South Sudan, was arguing with me some years ago, back in 2002, about how it couldn't work. And well, now he's president of an independent South Sudan. And I've seen how Czech and Slovakia separated peacefully. I've seen how Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia seceded mostly peacefully from the Soviet Union and are tremendous successes today. We have seen how Croatia and Slovenia broke from Yugoslavia. It took some fighting. In the case of Croatia, a lot of fighting, but their independence was established after 5 years. But they are free, independent, and well-recognized, successful countries now. We can see there's a lot. Brexit is an example of a country recently saying, no, we don't want any more globalist EU beast of Brussels business. We are an independent sovereign country. We've got our own history, our own laws, our own queen. We're not going to be just a municipality of the bureaucrats in Brussels. So I believe the whole trend, even as you see the United States in the Trump revolution, and I'm talking about Trump, the candidate, and what he stood for in the election, not as much what's happened since, but you could see the people saying no to the mass media, no to the New World Order, no to both the Republican and Democratic parties' advocation, and they said, we want a candidate who's going to care about us and our needs and our country and put our interests first and not be involved in these globalist wars and all the rest. And so you can see that actually maybe there is a silent majority, that because no party in Britain that was heavily represented in Westminster was advocating Brexit. It was just a small party of UKIP, and yet a majority of British voters voted for Brexit, which just surprises many people. I think when I've traveled around Germany, Belgium, Holland, I've been astounded to see how much conservative views there are on the ground. Now, you get the impression like Europe is gone. Europe's liberal. Not so. You go there and you find it's not just the Polish people and the Hungarians, but even in Western Europe, even in Austria and Switzerland, you will find a tremendous resistance on the ground, and you don't hear their voice often, at least not through the mass media, only through independent communications like your own. Will you then hear the other side of the story? But I believe we're on the side of history when we back the nationalistic desires for decentralization to have a canton system like Switzerland, which is very successful, a free enterprise system like Singapore, Hong Kong, or Chile. This is the way of the future. We must say no to failure, as evidenced in Zimbabwe, Colombia, Cuba, North Korea, China. Do we need any more examples? I mean, we can see socialism and centralization is always a failure. We need decentralization and secession for a country that was forced into the Union of South Africa. Nobody gave the people of the Cape a chance to have a referendum. Do you want to be part of the British Empire's Union of South Africa, which is based on the Canada-type dominion? And we were forced into it by a war, effectively. And so there's every reason, both morally and legally, because the right of self-determination is written into the United Nations Bill of Rights and into the South African Constitution. And we would like to exercise that right of self-determination.
But Dr. Hammond, do you think that the ANC is just going to sit by idly and say, okay, guys, you can go now? Because who are the taxpayers? Who are supporting these millions and millions on the dole in South Africa?
That's correct. Now, R.W. Johnson is an author, a British economist who's written How Long Will South Africa Survive? And he's come to the conclusion that the money's going to run out and central government's going to collapse. And at that point, the most likely scenario is decentralization, and the Western Cape being the most successful, functional, efficient part of South Africa would probably be the first to declare independence. And that it's workable because we're paying 4 times more taxes than is spent in our own province. Therefore, if we seceded, we could halve our taxes and double our services. Actually, we could do better than that because we won't need all the corruption, incompetence, and nonsense that they've got. We could probably bring our taxes down to 1%, So, and still run well. We could be a tax haven like Hong Kong and Singapore, and see our economy grow much greater too. So no, what would the ANC do? Well, the first thing is, I think they hate the Cape, because despite all their busing of people, and they haven't managed to change the demographics enough to gain it, and if they lost the Cape, they would suddenly become a major majority in the rest of the country. They may let the Cape go simply because we're a curse and a pain to them in terms of resistance. So it's not totally to think that they will necessarily want to hold on just for all they're worth, because the Cape's source of almost all of the opposition, almost all of the grief that they suffer. And I think that it's quite possible, and may say, we could get a benefit here. Nevertheless, it may not be their call to make, because central government is going to collapse. And when their money runs out and they're unable to continue to pay the bills, then it'll be very hard for them to keep the Cape in. And if you've seen the way their so-called National Defence Force has gone, there won't be too much they can do about it.
Yes, there is nothing left of it. I mean, they had to bring in Cuban mechanics to maintain their vehicles, which are now sitting in rusting heaps in the Transvaal. It's an unbelievable mess. There is no defence force, really.
No, they are fat, overweight, incompetent, lazy, and they're normally missing. They're more AWOL than present. I would say that the Botswana Defence Force is more operationally effective than the whole so-called South African National Defence Force.
And yet they're calling now for white people to come back to the police force and come back to the defence force. And yet in the same breath, singing about killing the whites, getting rid of the whites, taking their land away, etc., etc. But come back. And the same thing is happening in Rhodesia right now. This new fellow, I can't pronounce his name, I'm afraid. I can't pronounce his name. But he's also calling for the whites to come back and farm there. Anybody who did that must be crazy, in my opinion.
Well, brave people. I've seen a few of them going back. They may not be wise, but they're certainly very courageous.
Yeah, very, very, because they've gone through this already and are setting themselves up to go through it again. It's scary to me. But so what we would like to talk about today is the lies about South Africa that have brought us to the place that we're in now. The historic lies, everything that I see outside of South Africa and now in South African history books is lies. And I'd like to discuss that, because that is what the world believes we as free white South Africans are. We are horrible people who oppressed and murdered blacks at a rate of knots never seen in this world before. And that's what they believe. So can we address that?
Yes, well, let me just regurgitate some of the propaganda, because in case there's anybody out there who hasn't heard it. But once upon a time, everybody lived in peace and harmony and democratic tranquility, in great riches and affluence in Africa. And along came the evil, demonic Dutch settlers who invaded and massacred and then stole all the industry and wealth of the people and oppressed the people just because of the color of their skins. And apartheid was the greatest evil in the history of the world. And colonialism was the worst thing that ever happened to Africa. And then along came Saint Nelson Mandela, and he brought about the freedom of all people. He brought about the Rainbow Nation. He abolished apartheid, and everyone lived happily ever after. Okay, so that's the propaganda which we've heard. Oh, and I should have also added, all whites are always racist, and no blacks have ever been racist. So, okay, so that's some of the lies. Now, I was blessed in Rhodesia. My first history teacher in high school was Mr. Rhys Davies, who was also a member of Parliament, and his father had been a political leader in Britain in the Second World War. And Mr. Rhys Davies said to us in our first history lecture, it was so shocking, I could never forget it, and embedded in my mind so many years later, 40 years later. He said, beware the victor's version. Wartime propaganda morphs into peacetime textbooks. Governments lie. He said, we know that the British government is lying about us in Rhodesia now. And we all knew that. Why then do you trust the British government's version of the First and Second World War, or anything else for that matter? And I thought, well, that's true. Where's he going with this? And he proceeded to challenge us. Think outside the box. Stop just regurgitating the textbook. If you knew what kind of people wrote the textbooks, if you knew what kind of government committees are appointed to write textbooks and what their briefs are, you would never trust what's in textbook. I want you to think critically, ask why. The difference between education and indoctrination is indoctrination tells you what to think. Education teaches you how to think critically. Now, I must say, praise God, in Rhodesia, we had education. They taught us how to think. They taught us how to think critically. The textbooks in school in Rhodesia, I remember, was 1984 by George Orwell, Animal Farm by George Orwell, of course, Shakespeare, Dickens, Jane Austen, and so on. I mean, we had good education, and they taught us to think critically. And I found when I came to South Africa, I was quite shocked to find the South African schools were not as high in the level of textual criticism of, for example, English history books and literature. So I actually think that the Rhodesian education was superior in many ways to what I got in my final year of matric in South Africa. For example, I remember the school teacher getting horrified that I was questioning the textbook and contradicting the official line. And I was able to say, but that's what we were taught to do at school. And evidently that was not quite the philosophy down in South Africa at the time. They followed the party line a bit more, but still, it was still a good education. But in Rhodesia, I think we got an excellent education. Well, my favorite film when I was very young was the Man from U.N.C.L.E. series. And according to that, there were two United Nations agents, a Russian and American, pre-Glasnost, working together under the United Nations to keep the world safe for democracy. Yay, for the UN, Men from U.N.C.L.E. However, in my school, in my class even, there were some children whose parents came from the Belgian Congo. In fact, they were very young, but they came from the Congo when it was the Belgian Congo. And I had them saying, oh no, the United Nations are not the good guys. The UN bombed our town of Elizabethville, what today is Lubumbashi. They invaded Katanga. They forced us to rejoin the communist chaos of the Congo. They looted our home. They bombed our school and our church. They stole everything they wanted out of our vehicle as we were fleeing across the border from Katanga into northern Rhodesia, en route to southern Rhodesia, where we were. So this is one of the first, I've got a disconnect here. The media is telling me one thing, but the people next door to me in my desk in school are telling me something very different. Something else made me think we've been lied to. My father, who was veteran of the Second World War, all 6 years, fought in North Africa and Italy, he said to me, every time we saw a war film, he'd sort of shake his head and say, it wasn't like that. And that sounded a bit strange. I mean, I'd just seen it with my own eyes. I mean, how can the camera lie? I didn't quite understand about special effects yet. And he would say things like, the Germans were gentlemen. They were honorable people. I don't believe any of these atrocity stories. He said, Africa Corps were gentlemen. Erwin Rommel was the best. And he said, I never saw, nor did I ever hear of any atrocity. I don't believe any of this. And he'd say things like the Germans were never our enemies and the French were never our friends, neither were the Russians for that matter. And so that was a bit strange because here's my dad who was actually in the Second World War, and he's given me a different version from the cocaine-sniffing, blaspheming drug addicts and pedophiles in Hollywood. And yeah, this is rough. I mean, who do I believe? Do I believe these blaspheming pedophiles and cocaine-sniffing drug addicts in Los Angeles, or do I believe my father? Well, then I started to meet a whole lot of other veterans. I mean, I've met people, when I was very young, I met people who had fought in the Madibili War of 1893 and the Mashona War of 1893. I met people who came up in the pioneer column. I met people who'd been in the British concentration camps in Anglo-Boer War. I remember I've met and discussed with people in the Army and Navy in this First World War. And I've met a lot of people who fought in the Second World War. German, Russian, Ukrainian, Romanian, Hungarian, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African, Rhodesian. And interestingly enough, most of them were seriously giving different versions of history to what we were getting in our textbooks and in history. For example, I go to Poland, and I'm helping persecuted church in Poland, and I see a memorial for Karin Forest. It says Karin 1940. So I immediately said, being quite a history buff, don't you mean 1941? And he stopped and looked at me and said, don't tell me you believe the Russian propaganda. What Russian propaganda? I said, the Russians massacred all the Polish officers in Karin. I said, well, our history book said the Germans did. That's what a whole of them were hung at Nuremberg for, that very crime, and killing all the officers of the Polish. Said, no, where's Karin? Look at the map. You know, I'd never actually looked at a map. And there's Karin next to Smolensk. Boy, that's very far in Russia. That's extremely far from Germany and Poland. Oh, wow. I mean, if you just look at the map, it already, okay, I see the problem here. Well, today, even Yeltsin and Gorbachev, and not just Gorbachev, but Yeltsin and Putin have admitted that, in fact, it was the Russians who murdered all the Polish officers at Karin, even though our textbooks to this day say it was a German atrocity that the Allies knew. In fact, the British government, now I'm being told by the Polish, the British assassinated the Polish government in exile, the entire government in exile, including General Sikorski, with his daughter and his whole cabinet. There they were in Gibraltar, and the whole of them get terminated because he was demanding investigation by the International Red Cross and so on. And both Churchill and FDR decided we've got to get rid of our ally. I mean, this is the Allies in the war for democracy. And they decide to wipe out the head of the Polish government in exile, General Sikorski, who's an ally because he's wanting to get to the bottom of the truth of what's happened to all of his officers who were murdered by the Soviet Union, Stalin, who's the ally of the democracy, so-called. Well, my friends in Eastern Europe, everywhere from Poland through to Romania and Hungary, they said, what freedom? We never got any freedom. You betrayed us. You betrayed 100 million Christians and 15 nations behind the Iron Curtain, the Yalta Agreement. And I was told, do you realize that we were fighting in the field? Some of them had grandfathers fighting in Lithuania till 1954, 9 years after the war was over. Ukraine were fighting company level with artillery against the Soviet Union till 1955, 10 years after the war, and they never got a bullet, bandage, or any aid from the Allies. And here we thought, I mean, I grew up thinking we were the good guys and we fought for freedom, and I had no idea of most of what was going on. I must say, my history teacher in religion, Mr. Rhys Davies, he understood these things. He, in fact, said to us, you'll never understand the Second World War unless you understand the Versailles Treaty, the worst treaty in the history of the world, and how reprehensible it was and how it had to be overturned and changed. And in fact, if you look at your map of Europe today, it looks more like the German ceasefire with Russia of Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which demanded the independence of Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Belarus, and all of that. And in fact, that was reversed by Versailles, and yet now you can see how many years later they've gone back to what the Germans redrew the map with their treaty with the Russians when they won the war on the Eastern Front in 1918. So there's so many things we've been lied to. And now I've been told that what we did in Rhodesia was terrible. Well, I grew up with a father who's a colonial, and one of the first things he taught me is to respect the black people, to not call him boy. Remember, he's older than you. Respect them, and remember, they are not your servants. They're your parents' servants, and you have no right to give them instructions and orders and so on. And my parents taught me not to be lazy, make your own bed, this, that, and the other, and so on, and polish your shoes. And I mean, I knew the Matabele. I knew their stories. I knew about Shaka and Lubengula and Mazilakazi and all this as a young boy. And I understood the Matabele. And to this day, I like the Zulus and the Matabele. I've got many of their friends. And so what I saw in Rhodesia was how the Matabele would come to my father for all sorts of advice. And when they were injured, they came to my mother being a nurse. In fact, I remember this Matabele coming to our kitchen, sitting down. I must have only been about 5, but I couldn't forget it because the man had an axe sticking out of his head. I mean, axe sticking there. And so my mother sat him down and gave him he asked for some aspirins. Well, my mother said, you need a bit more than that. Gave him some of these things, sat him down. And when she pulled the axe out of his head, no problem, But when he saw some of his blood drop in the floor, he hit the floor, yes, out. But my mother and father, they cared for the local people, and they were typical colonials. They would do anything to help the people working in the hotel and so on. And I was very, very early on taught respect for people of other races. Okay, now I come through to South Africa, and in South Africa, we know the South Africans have this evil apartheid system, and in Rhodesia, we were highly critical. My family is English liberal, highly critical of apartheid, very critical of the Afrikaners in the National Party, and I might say highly critical of Prime Minister Verwoerd. I thought he was a bad man at the time. And so when we came to South Africa, I expected to see black people being abused. In fact, I didn't see that. I saw all the whites, even the whites who made racist jokes, I saw them going out of their way to help black people. So, for example, in the army, one of the big Afrikaner football, rugby types, he'd make jokes, inappropriate jokes about people of other races. And, you think, oh, give it a break. But he's the one who broke cover in the middle of a firefight to rescue a black woman and her child caught in the crossfire and get them to safety at the risk of his own life. And I've met other racist farmers who I've stayed with who would make a joke, but at 2 a.m, they up there driving their maid's son to the hospital because he's sick, paying for it and so on. So this is, in my traveling, and I've stayed in a lot of homes and I've traveled very far and wide across the country. And I must say, I can say the worst racism I have witnessed from whites is inappropriate jokes. And maybe sometimes talking in a disparaging way to a person. But I've never seen them actually harm the people. Far from that, I've seen them going out of the way to help them. Whereas today, we're seeing black racism is murder, torture, torturing kids, boiling babies, chopping up grandmothers, doing the most hideous, we don't even want to talk about the atrocities. So since, let's just put the context. Under Hendrik Verwoerd, who is meant to be evil, when he was Prime Minister of South Africa, he electrified the country, put the whole country on a grid. He built some of the greatest hydroelectric dams. He paved the roads from one side of the country to the other. My parents used to travel N1 from Cape Town, Joburg on gravel roads, opening farm gates to get through. He really modernized the country, and he got South Africa out of debt, so South Africa didn't owe a dime to anybody. And no wonder the banksters wanted him dead, as Stephen Mitford Goodson, his biographer, points out in his book on Hendrik French Verwoerd, that in fact it was the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, and so on who gave the order, this man must go. He's standing in the way of the New World Order. Hendrik Verwoerd, who's meant to have been an evil man, under him, murder rate in the country is about 169 a year. 169 a year, let's say 170 on average every year. Under Nelson Mandela, Saint Nelson Mandela, 25,000 people were murdered a year officially. Although Interpol said it was 35,000, and the South African Medical Association, their records were that it was higher than that. And according to some statistics, we could have been at 48,000, 50,000 murders a year under Mandela. But okay, let's just take the official version of murder and let's put it down to 25,000. Bear in mind, that's without a war. So during the war, and South Africa was fighting a serious war for 26 years against SWAPO, and we fought for a long time in Angola. We were fighting against the Cubans for 14 years in Angola and the Soviets. During that intensive time of war for 26 years, the last 14 of which was heavy conventional warfare, including tank battles, including artillery duels, including massed attacks and even dogfights with MiGs and Mirages in the air. We had 680 South African soldiers thereabouts die. 680 died in 26 years of war. We lose more people than that in any given month. And now this is during peace. And so Hendrik Verwoerd, do you know, he would actually sit in the garden with his gardener as prime minister and teach him to read and write. That he paid for the education of innumerable black people. He increased literacy rate tenfold. He did so much to even provide adult literacy classes I've had many black people say to me, nobody did more for us black people than Hendrik Verwoerd. I've had black people say to me, very educated black people, Hendrik Verwoerd built more houses for black people than Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki combined, and in less time. And his houses are still standing, and they're still good, versus the RDP rubbish built by Mandela's people and Joe Slovo that fell to pieces within a few years or less. So the truth of South Africa is actually inverted. It's exactly the opposite of what we've been told. What we've been told is that the white South Africans are the most racist people on the planet. Actually, I think the white South Africans might have done more good for the black people than anyone else in history has done. The Rhodesians had probably the best race relations in the continent. And the black people in Rhodesia were the most educated and literate in all the continent. And nobody died of starvation in Rhodesia. In fact, I don't think anyone starved in Rhodesia, with the exception of maybe some white females who were starving themselves through a diet, maybe. There could have been some white anorexic people, but no black people were anorexic. The black people were, I mean, they were stout. They were on gravy train. Whereas not under Mugabe. Under Mugabe, black people been starving to death and fleeing. In fact, here's a fact. Let any liberal chew on this and explain it. Virtually nobody fled Rhodesia. Almost nobody fled except a criminal escaping justice, South Africa under apartheid. But millions of black people moved into South Africa, and hundreds of thousands moved into Rhodesia, fleeing from Mozambique, Zambia, and so on. And people moved from the Congo and Angola into South Africa. That isn't meant to happen. People don't flee to East Germany across the Berlin Wall. They went the other way. People don't flee to Cuba. People don't flee to China and North Korea. I mean, they go the other way. They're fleeing to South Korea. And people flee towards freedom. Well, during the whole time of apartheid, blacks were migrating into Africa. Here's a fact. Most of the black people in South Africa were not born here. Most of the black people in South Africa are immigrants. And so I and other white people whose ancestry may go back many generations, some people's go back 350 years, they're called expatriates and colonials. But a black man who arrived from the Congo yesterday is called indigenous. Now, this is nonsense. The whole situation in South Africa is what we've got is a lot of lies, big lies, and the big lies are told in order to be a smokescreen for the ANC cancer criminals in order to loot, rape, and pillage our country. And they could never get away with the crimes. Mugabe could never have got away with 37 years of looting Zimbabwe except for the lie that he was a freedom fighter and the lie of colonial oppression. And honestly, here's the fact. The white colonials doubled and in many cases trebled the life expectancy of the people in Africa. Mugabe has halved the life expectancy of people. When Ian Smith resigned as Prime Minister of Rhodesia in 1979, life expectancy in Rhodesia was about 64. Today, the life expectancy in Zimbabwe is about 32. So literally, Mugabe has halved life expectancy in his time. And that's meant to be oppression. That's meant to be freedom. And that's with the World Food Program and the World Health Organization giving all kinds of free medical, free food, and USAID and all the rest. So really and truly, the facts expose the lies. The colonials lifted people's life expectancies, whereas the so-called liberators have massacred the people by the millions. And more than half of the total population of Zimbabwe fled the country since its liberation by Mugabe. That's voting with defeat.
And so I'd like to address the lie of Saint Nelson Mandela.
Yes.
Because he is a hero everywhere. There are statues to him everywhere. And that is just so fake, it makes me ill. Could we address that? Because you did meet the man. You had meetings with the man. You spoke to him about the evil that he brought into our country. Could we talk about that lie? Because the world needs to face the truth about that man.
Yes. Well, first of all, a lot of people think Nelson Mandela was locked up because he wrote a poem like Alexander Solzhenitsyn. In fact, he was in prison for murder and for terrorism and for treason and for sabotage and for insurrection, sedition. I mean, there's the whole range of, I think there was over 150 charges against him. And he was trained as a lawyer and he pleaded guilty. And that's why Amnesty International, when they were asked to deal with him during the whole Free Mandela frenzy of the 80s, they said, well, he's not a political prisoner. He had his day in court and he had a fair trial. And he's not a political prisoner. He committed violence, and he's even been offered under P.W. Botha, the president of South Africa in the 80s, freedom if he would renounce violence. That they would open the prison doors and let him free, which was super gracious. Because bear in mind, in 1962, when Nelson Mandela was arrested, captured, if he had been arrested in France for the same crimes, he would have been guillotined. If he had been arrested in Britain for that, he would have been hung. And if he'd been arrested for those crimes in the United States of America, they would have electrocuted him in 1960s. That's a fact. And the most liberal newspaper in South Africa, the Rand Daily Mail, which was virtually communist, their editorial, when Mandela got a sentence of life imprisonment, praised the restraint and the generosity of the judges and the independence of the judiciary, because everyone expected them to get the death penalty. And they were like, what a far-sighted, generous, kind, I mean, they couldn't sing the praise of this judge high enough. In fact, at the time, Henrik Wood was quite shocked that the judge had not sentenced him to death, because, in fact, his crimes were so serious that, well, he would have been anywhere in the world. There probably wasn't a country in the world outside of Sweden that would have given him anything less than that. So Mandela was not in prison for opposing apartheid. There's a lot of people opposed apartheid. For goodness sakes, my father opposed apartheid. I opposed apartheid. Desmond Tutu opposed apartheid. A lot of people opposed apartheid and never saw the inside of a prison. But Mandela was never in prison for opposing apartheid. He was in prison for terrorism, violence, revolutionary terrorism. And he was planning to turn the country upside down and create havoc and violence. Do you know that Nelson Mandela was trained by the Cuban DGI, by their secret police, including by Che Guevara, the famous revolutionary sidekick executioner of Fidel Castro? So he was a seriously dangerous man. Mandela had been trained in Algeria, he'd been trained in Ethiopia. He was a revolutionary and he was a communist. Now, Mandela claimed throughout his life not to be a communist, and he committed perjury because he had evidence in his own handwriting, How to Be a Good Communist book, submitted into evidence, and he didn't question it. And when he died, his family and the entire ANC and the Southern Communist Party and the whole Communist International said, Mandela was one of us. He's a communist. He's a senior member of the Southern Communist Party, always was, and we only denied that he was for tactical reasons. In other words, they lied. And Mandela was guilty of perjury for over 50 years of his life. But, okay, so Nelson Mandela, while he's imprisoned, people were saying, he's an old man, he's a sick man, he's going to die in prison. This is really just like they did for the Ayatollah Khomeini. And you've got to release him, because if he dies in prison, it's going to be really bad. And they release him, and well, he lives a long time afterwards too. So obviously that was life. The Billy Graham Association was publishing, Nelson Mandela has come to Christ in prison. He's been converted. He's a born-again Christian. And a lot of gullible people were saying this all over the world. And I was super skeptical. So I wrote to Billy Graham Association to find out what's the source. And they said, well, that would be Michael Cassidy and Africa Enterprise. So we contacted Michael Cassidy of Africa Enterprise, who's known to be a good friend of the World Council of Churches. He would talk evangelical and embrace the ecumenicals, who would then give liberation theology. And he said, the Billy Graham Association said, well, they said, you're the source. And so they both kind of blamed one another, and nobody took responsibility. And Mandela comes out of prison, and we're waiting to hear a Solzhenitsyn type of Christian confession, and all you hear is communism and the fist in front of the red flag with the Hammond sickle and all the rest. And in fact, he spoke consistent Marxism, even while he said, I'm not a communist. But everything he said and everything he did was Marxist. Sometimes he did the dialectic, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But thesis, antithesis, synthesis, Hegelian dialectic. And the man was actually very deceptive, as he even admitted later. So now Mandela gets out of prison, and then he becomes president and so on. And at his inauguration in Pretoria, he says, never, 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 never again will any South African be discriminated against on the basis of his race. And then he promptly went out and brought in race classification and job quotas, sports quotas, and all kinds of other racism. So now I'm a father. I've got 2 daughters who were born under apartheid, apparently. Well, they say we had apartheid in 1991. We didn't actually. We voted to abolish apartheid in 1983. I remember voting for that myself. I must say, with hindsight, I'm now sorry that I voted for that position, but we were sincerely wrong. We thought that it was in a way. We didn't realize why they had Group Areas Acts and why they had the Suppression of Communism Act and all that at the time. We realized later, a bit too late, but still. Okay, I'm coming from an English liberal family. So Mandela is out of prison in 1990, but he's not president. They're in negotiations. F.W. de Klerk is the president in 1991. My first daughter's born, and there's no race on her birth certificate. Interesting, because according to the United States, they are sanctioning South Africa because of apartheid. But we've only got 2 apartheid laws left, because all the apartheid laws have been scrapped by P.W. Botha, the president who got ousted in 1989. And the only 2 laws left when de Klerk comes in is the Race Classification Act, which they were not doing, even though it was on the statute books. My daughter, born 1993, also had no race on her birth certificate. And then, of course, was separate voters' rolls. And that was finally abolished by de Klerk. So when Mandela came in, there was no apartheid form to abolish. So anyone who says Mandela abolished apartheid is ignorant of history or is dishonest. My sons were born under Mandela, 1995 and 1999, and they both have their race in their birth certificate. Now, isn't that interesting? So Mandela brings race classification back, job reservations and racial quotas, because he wants to push affirmative action. But wait a minute, affirmative action is run in America and Europe to help minorities. But in South Africa, apartheid is, in fact, apartheid was there to help the black people, protecting them from whites investing in the shops and all this in their areas. So they had complete control over their areas, and whites were not allowed to own land, and Indians couldn't open businesses in a black area because those were reserved for them and protected. And so apartheid actually was a kind of affirmative action that sought to protect blacks from exploitation by whites or Asians, and to give them control over their own areas, and to provide, and to even build industries and so on. Anyway, Mandela does the opposite thing. He doesn't do anything to help the whites. He does everything he can to help the majority. But majorities don't need protection. It's the minorities who need protection. And so Mandela starts race classification. Okay, well, Mandela starts a whole lot of other things too. He wants to legalize abortion, pornography, Sabbath desecration, perversion, homosexual marriages, abolishes the vice squad. In fact, all the different police specialized units are dealing with everything from terrorism, vice, gets rid of all the specialized units, which means that these crimes just explode because there's no specialized police focused on these crimes, especially vice. And, well, understanding where the prostitutes get most of the customers from, I suppose, understandable. Parliamentarians want to abolish the police investigating and prosecuting those sort of things. They've literally got brothels right next to Parliament, and they all tell us who their main customers are. At one point, when there was an attempt to move Parliament up to the Transvaal, to what they call Gauteng, the prostitutes were complaining that they'd lose most of their customers if the Parliament moved. And that was publicly, it was that open. And it's not even a joke. I mean, it's true. So, okay, I marched 30,000 people to Parliament in 1995 to protest Mandela's paganization of the country. It was the anniversary of Mandela becoming president, May 1995. We shut down Cape Town, 30,000 of us. The people are still leaving the castle area when we had a solid mass filling the roads all the way through to Parliament. And at Parliament, in fact, they said the ANC were in terror because they thought we were going to storm the gates and hang them from the lamppost, which might not have been a bad idea, but that wasn't in our mind at the time. We were just coming to protest. And they were terrified, absolutely terrified. There'd never been protests like this in Cape Town before. And they pushed Cyril Ramaphosa out to come to placate us. And Cyril Ramaphosa, he's the one who is tipped to be the next leader of the ANC cancer mafia. And so Cyril Ramaphosa he's pushed out the door. He's the chairman of the Constitutional Convention. And so they pushed him out to deal with us. And he was terrified. I could see his shaking, sweating. His eyes were wide. He was absolutely terrified. And he comes there and he's standing next to me by the platform. And he sees a Zulu friend of mine next to me Fano Sabisi, Reverend Fano Sabisi, and said, "Brother, can I borrow your Bible?" And he grabbed his black Bible. It was a leather-bound Bible bought by my father-in-law in Phoenix, engraved Reverend Fano Sabisi on the cover. And you could see it, this gilt engravement. So Cyril Ramaphosa goes up onto the platform and he lifts this Bible above his head and said, "I am also a born-again Christian. I bring my Bible to Parliament every day. Look, see, here's my Bible. I bring my Bible to Parliament. I read the Bible every day." And Fano and I looked at one another. I mean, we know politicians lie, but that blatantly, if I had a camera in my hand, I could have got a picture of him holding Reverend Fano Sabisi's Bible with the gilt edge there on, and sadly, a lot of the people were cheering, clapping, and swallowing this diatribe, this professional liar. But anyway, so after another march protesting Mandela's policies, where I marched again, masses of Cape Townians there, one of his people came and summoned me to the president's home. So we marched on Tuesday. On Thursday, Nelson Mandela summoned me to his mansion, which is the house that Cecil John Rhodes built. Cecil Rhodes, when he was Prime Minister of South Africa, he didn't take a salary, sort of like Trump, and he said, "I don't need it." And he built a palace for future prime ministers of the country. And interesting, unlike Zuma, who used public money to build himself a palace. But anyway, things used to be different. We used to have civil servants who wrote "Your humble servant" at the bottom of the letters. I don't think our civil servants today know what a civil servant's meant to be. I don't think they know how to be humble either. So I'm summoned to Mandela because he's the president at the time, and I went to meet him. Now I'm only at that stage, I'm 35 years old, and as I walked in to meet Nelson Mandela, his first question was, "So, Mr. Hammond, what were you doing in the years of struggle?" Struggle's their word for their terrorist campaign. I looked at him and I said, "I was fighting people like you, sir." And he laughed and he slapped his knee and he stood up and he shook my hand again. He said, "I'm so glad to meet an honest white man." He said, "All these whites keep telling me how they always opposed apartheid. They never supported the National Party and they always supported me. I wondered how the National Party stayed in power 44 years. I said, "Well, Mr. Mandela, make no mistake, we were not fighting for apartheid. We were fighting against communism and against terrorism." And he then sat back and he said, "Apartheid was the greatest evil in the history of the world." I said, "I cannot agree with that, Mr. President." I said, "That prize must go to your friends, your supporters, the communists." In the 20th century, communist governments have killed 160 million people. I'm not talking about people killed in war. I'm not talking about people killed in the crossfire. I mean 160 million civilians killed by their own governments, secular governments, socialist governments, communist governments, such as in the Soviet Union, killed in times of peace. 160 million corpses left in the 20th century from socialist, secular, humanist, secular states, communist states. And he is still silent. He is just sitting there staring at me. So I carried on. I said, that includes 66 million Christians killed by Joseph Stalin and Lenin in the Soviet Union. That includes over 68 million Chinese killed by Mao Zedong in the Communist Revolution in China. And I continued through the 3 million killed in Cambodia by the Pol Pot Khmer Rouge. And I worked my way through, because he's still silent, so I went on to Mengistu's Ethiopia and the Red Terror there, and Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe, and I ended off with Cuba, Fidel Castro's Cuba, because he had just had Fidel Castro as a guest of the Southern government to speak to the joint houses of parliament, and he gave him the biggest award that a president of South Africa can give. Fidel Castro is obviously the #1 fan and pal of the ANC and Mandela. So I ended with Cuba. When I stopped, he was staring at the ceiling, looking back in time or something like this. And he said, when I was a prisoner of the Boers on Robben Island, they refused to allow me to wear sunglasses. Now, I've seen pictures. If you go to Nelson Mandela Gateway, the tourist cubicle, big place where you go on a ferry out to Robben Island to burn incense in his cell, then they've got a huge picture, I mean a massive Chairman Mao-sized picture of Nelson Mandela leaning on his shovel in front of his vegetable garden in Robben Island with his hat on and his sunglasses. in black and white. Now, I mean, I presume what he's saying is that at the very beginning, maybe they didn't allow him to wear sunglasses immediately, but they certainly did later. Anyway, I didn't know all that then. I hadn't seen that picture yet. So I just said to him, Mr. Mandela, I also have very sensitive eyes. And I can appreciate how uncomfortable that must have been. But I'm sure you will agree, Mr. President, that hardly compares with the kind of atrocities documented by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag archipelago. And he then said, 40 years ago, Christians justified apartheid. I said, Mr. Mandela, it won't be 40 years from now. People will question your humanity for legalizing abortion. You questioning the Christianity of people who legalized apartheid 40 years ago. But you are not denying babies the same areas. You're not giving the babies separate areas. You're not putting them on a separate voters roll. You're not giving them separate beaches. You're taking away their right to life before they can even be born. You've replaced apartheid with abortion. You've replaced discrimination on the basis of race with discrimination on the basis of age. And abortion's worse than apartheid. You're killing the most innocent, helpless children of all, pre-born babies. Well, he then spoke about some other apartheid something, and I said, Mr. Mandela, your Shishaba's the magazine of the ANC, was printed for decades in East Berlin by the Stasi. You know, as well as I do, that one of the worst apartheids in our lifetime has been the Berlin Wall that divided people of the same family, people of the same race and language from one another. The Berlin Wall divided a country between slave and free. And do you know that people were shot in the back for attempting to leave the socialist workers' paradise of East Germany for freedom in West Germany? And I said, Mr. Mandela, you're supporting an even worse apartheid than the Berlin Wall. You're wanting to separate a mother from a baby from its life support system of the mother. And so, you know, this is the kind of way we had this ping pong match, this sort of verbal backwards and forwards. And at a certain point, as the clock struck the hour, we'd been in his lounge for an hour, he stood up and he said, you may take your pictures now. Now, to be honest, I hadn't even considered the possibility of taking pictures. I hadn't brought a camera, and I have no idea what I'd do with a picture of Nelson Mandela and me. I mean, why? And I said, no, thank you. And I didn't mean to be rude. I really didn't. I was trying to be polite. And it looked like we'd slapped him in the face with a wet fish. I mean, the shock in his face, his jaw dropped open. And I followed up with, but we would like to pray with you, Mr. President. And immediately said, no, that's very private. I'd rather not. And I acted like I hadn't heard him. And I put my hand on his one shoulder. And Dumini Zoons was with me, put his hand on the other shoulder. And we prayed, Lord Jesus, do not give Mr. Mandela one moment's peace until he does what he knows is right. Lord Jesus, do not allow him a moment's peace until he does what he knows is right and enacts legislation to protect the most innocent and helpless citizens of all, pre-born babies from the violence and the evil of abortion. Lord Jesus, do not allow Mr. Mandela any peace until he bows his knees to you as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the coming judge, before whom each one of us will stand and give an account of our lives. So I prayed like that, and Dumini Stevenson gave something along that line too. And as we opened our eyes and lifted hands, I could see that he was steaming. He was still very restrained. I mean, he can be a very suave and charismatic and charming person. He's very good at that sort of thing. I mean, a real politician. But I could see he was seething under the outward veneer. And he said, my door is always open to you, Mr. Hammond. I'm always responsive to the concerns of your constituency. And just earlier, I should add something else. We'd complained about the new constitution. And he said, oh, don't worry about the constitution. He said, it's written. Most people can't read. Most people don't read. Who's going to read the constitution? I said, oh, thank you, Mr. Mandela. Does that mean that we will not be prosecuted when we oppose your legalization of abortion and these other evils in this constitution? And again, he ignored it. But interesting how he was trying to say, it doesn't matter what's, and he followed up with, it doesn't matter what's written. He said, what matters what people see. It's important that people see me having tea with Mrs. Verwoerd, Henrik Verwoerd, which he did. It's important that they see me going into a Dutch Reformed church service, which he did once. And he also went to Church of England service at one point. Of course, he also went to a mosque, and he also went to a Hindu temple. I mean, he did a few, he knew about these sort of symbols, propaganda points. And he said it's important for people to see me sitting down talking to Colonel Constant Viljoen. And it's important that people see me sitting down, listening to you and responsive to your concerns. You see, I represented the masses of Christians who had protested in the streets. And so what he was doing was he was looking for, he obviously understood propaganda, and he understood images, not just a soundbite, but a picture, the power of a picture. Of course, it was deceptive. It didn't represent his heart or his real policy. But so that's what he said. Well, now, so we leave Mandela's presence. Now, that's Thursday. We marched on Tuesday. On Thursday, we summoned to meet the president. Monday morning, the very next Monday, we get two senior investigators of the Inland Revenue Service. That's our version of the IRS, the Inland Revenue Service. And they want to start an audit. And for 7 years, they audit my wife and I, our mission, and every ministry we're involved in. And they go back 6 years. So we had a 13-year audit. So, and by the way, they tried everything. They tried to put us in jail. But we, thankfully, our first chairman of the board was a chartered accountant. And Reverend Doc Watson kept his chartered accountancy up till the end of his days, even though he was a minister of the gospel for most of his life. And he ensured that our books were excellent, which they wouldn't have been if it was up to me, because, I mean, I never thought finances, and I don't think maths. But by God's grace, our chairman of the board had seen our books in order, and these Inland Revenue Service senior investigators were perplexed how they couldn't find something wrong with our books, because, you know, most charity organizations would have some discrepancies. There were none. And at the end, they had to agree that we owed them nothing. And so that's my experience in Nelson Mandela. He was charming, he was suave, he was charismatic, but he set his dogs on us.
Yeah, I was about to intervene and say, I'm surprised you weren't arrested after that. Wow.
They tried.
Wow. It was worse than that, because 13 years of investigation is...
I mean, I don't want to give the wrong impression. It was intimidating. It was very intimidating. Because I'm not a legal person. I'm not a financial or accountant person. Neither is my wife. And for us, it was seriously intimidating. And we looked several times. We had our lawyers and so on saying, you will not survive. They are going to crush you. You will not be able. And I had people advising me, just skip the country and so on. I said, I can't do that. This is my home. We've got a ministry of people who depend on us. And so they were putting every pressure. I think they wanted me to flee. And I'm damned if I'm going to do that, because this is my country. They can flee if they want. This is my home, and I'm not about to let these people take my home. And I'm not about to continue to be a minority in my own country. I want my own country back, and these criminals need to be exposed for what they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, wow, that's quite an experience you've been through. And how are you finding it nowadays with everything that's going on? I mean, there's been an accelerated pitch agenda against sort of the white minorities.
Well, you know, it's like living in a war zone, living in condition orange and red the whole time. You know, condition white is when people are oblivious, a condition yellow, a little bit alert, condition orange, serious alert, condition red, very serious, condition black, you know, like you're dead. So condition red is serious war. And so we're living in condition orange and red just about the whole time. Now, I grew up with school teachers in Rhodesia carrying machine guns, mothers pushing their prams in the shops and streets with them, probably a 9mm submachine gun over their shoulder or a pistol on their hip. School teachers carrying rifles when you're going on school buses, on roads where ambushes could take place. You know, don't go out the front door without first switching off the light behind you. Don't open curtains without switching off the lights behind you, and so on. And whenever you switch on the lights, make sure you've closed the curtains first. We were brought up in a condition of war. From age 6, I was being taught basic principles like this. That was life in Rhodesia, especially when we visited our family members on the farm. And then it was very serious. Then, of course, in the South African Army, we were in war. But, you know, I think we were safer in the war than we are today in South Africa. In the middle of the war, even walking in the operational area and behind enemy lines in Angola, and I've done a lot of ministry behind enemy lines as a missionary, smuggling into communist Mozambique and Angola, working with the Renamo guerrillas in Mozambique, training the chaplains, working with the SPLA freedom fighters in Sudan, working with the UNITA freedom fighters of GENOCIDE in Angola. So I've spent a lot of my life, I've spent many, many years walking in areas where landmines are the national plant, where aerial bombardments from Soviet-type aircraft is common, and where we can get ambushed, and where I have been. But to be honest, I think I felt safe in most of those situations, and I feel in most of South Africa most of the time today. We are living in a time when we can be attacked at any time, anywhere, including in our own homes, home invasions, terrorism. My elder brother had a home invasion. Now, he lived up in the Transvaal at that time, and he was in Midrand, and his wife suddenly shouted, "Derek, there's blacks in a garden with guns." And he immediately retrieved his pistol, which was not on him, from his bedside table. He walked in the hallway, and there he was confronted by a big black man with a silver 45 caliber automatic aimed right at his head, and he was only about 2 meters away from my brother. And this man opened fire and fired 5 shots point blank at my elder brother, and they all missed. My brother cocked his firearm. His firearm did not have a round in the chamber at the time. He cocked his firearm, which to do that under fire is not an easy thing to do. People firing at you to chamber around confidently without a jam is difficult, but my brother was ex-Rhodesian Army, and he fired 3 shots back, hit this chap twice in the chest and stomach in the hallway, and this attacker stumbled out, and his 4 associates carried him to the car, and they got in the vehicle and they fled as my brother fired more shots at them. And thankfully he went and died off the premises, which was a lot more comfortable. My sister-in-law took her daughter and went into the safe room, which is a standard practice most South Africans have, into the safe room, and they locked the door, got on the floor and phoned for help, which was the standard operating procedure that any South African family must know. That the first thing the wife and children must do is get into the safe room, the most secure room, lock the door, phone for help, and then the dad will do what he can to neutralize the threat. This is if you are warned in time and you don't just get surprised in your living room by some thug with an axe or something like that.
If you have a firearm, Dr. Hammond, if you have a firearm, because in South Africa most people don't.
That is possible. Most people I know do. And in fact, the police chief in my area informed me I must always be armed and I must watch my back, and asked, can I afford a bodyguard? And I said, no, I can't. Well, in the light of the death threats that we've handed over to our police in our area, they said you must always be armed. And it's very nice when I've got to apply for my self-defense firearm license that the head of the police in my area says you must always be armed. And so, thank you very much. I appreciate that. They even wanted me to change my identity and come under the witness protection program because of the death threats against me, including from Sudan government and from Zimbabwe government, and fatwas from Islamic jihadists. So apparently don't like some of the books I write, it would seem. Maybe they're not as tolerant as they claim. So yes, my brother's scenario is not unusual, except for the fact that he was armed and he was ready and he responded and he was fast and accurate. But can I point out something to you that maybe you are not fully aware of? Most of our friends are not aware of the fact that most farm attacks fail. Now, if you look at the farm attack statistics, there are something in the region of 19,000 farm attacks have taken place, and 4,200 odd farmers and their family members have been murdered. Sometimes multiple people are murdered in a single farm attack. Statistically, most farm attacks fail. In fact, most of the attackers die or are wounded. And so I'm not in any way trying to minimize the seriousness of this genocide and this terrorist war, this low-intensity terrorist war against whites and particularly farmers in South Africa. But I do want to put a note of optimism here, and that is that a farm attack is not necessarily destined to win, even though they've got the initiative, even though they've got numbers on their side, even though they outnumber the farmer, even though they have more weapons and better weapons often, they fail more often than not. And many farmers, even though the farmer often has no warning, the farmers have often, bear in mind, many of our farmers have military background or were part of the commandos. And so the fact is, this in no way minimizes how serious it is to have 4,000 of your farmers murdered. But the farmers, even though that we can't afford an attrition war because there's more of them than there is of us, but the fact is the farmers are more often than not winning. If you think of it as a war, this isn't a one-sided war. Our side is putting up a decent resistance. Of course, how many farmers and family members want to live like that? But the fact still is we can fight and we can defend ourselves. One of my friends, one of our co-workers in our mission, Charles van Beek, was at the church at St. James in 1993, 25 July, when the PAC terrorists burst into the church, hurled hand grenades and opened fire. He only had a snub-nosed .38 pistol with 5 rounds in it. He fired back at these terrorists who had their automatic weapons, trained in Libya, and he wounded the one terrorist at the door who was spraying the congregation with gunfire, and they broke off the attack and fled. And he raced aside, fired at the vehicle where they were waiting over the vehicles as though they were waiting to ambush people fleeing from the church, and he fired again, and then they fled, leaving blood trails behind, which enabled the police to get DNA, track them down, and convict. But this is something I want us to understand and emphasize too. We can fight. We can resist. We should resist. We should make them pay a heavy toll. And I know that it doesn't lessen the crime of what is being done by these cowards and these mobs who are attacking, in many cases, almost defenseless farmers, and in many cases, great-grandparents, and they are torturing people in the 80s and so on. But we know cases of grandfathers beating thugs in their 20s who come with heavy weapons, and this chap's got a little 2.5 pistol, and he takes them down. So don't think of us as defenseless. We might be outnumbered, yes, but I think a lot of us can still put up a good fight.
Yes. Sorry, Karin, go on.
No, go ahead.
This is the thing that defines South Africans, no matter where we are, is there's a certain thing about being South African. I don't know if it's because as Sherlock Holmes said about the Boers, we're just such a hardy race, having been through wars, there is something about us. And I think perhaps that's why we're such a threat to the globalist agenda, and why perhaps there seems to be this subversive plot to eliminate the Boer Afrikaners. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I do indeed, and I must say I'm very impressed that quote that you gave. I've got this here in my book on the sketches from South African history. I just love this quote. It was printed out and distributed to us up at the border at the time when Sir Walter Walker, who was the head of NATO, British General, Sir Walter Walker visited the South African bases on the border of Southwest Africa, Angola, during the Cold War, and he was evaluating, and he actually quoted from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's famous quote in his book, The Great Boer War. And he quoted it, and at the end he said, "The South African army has the finest infantry in the world. There is no army in the world with the 9 months training, the intensive application of 15 months in the field as you have." Well, this is the quote from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, British, the author of Sherlock Holmes. "Take a community of Dutchmen of the type of those who defended themselves for 50 years against all the power of Spain, at a time when Spain was the greatest power in the world. Intermix them with a strain of those inflexible French Huguenots who gave up home and fortune and left the country forever at the time of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. The product must obviously be one of the most rugged, virile, unconquerable races ever seen upon earth. Take this formidable people and train them for 7 generations in constant warfare against savage men and ferocious beasts in circumstances under which no weakling could survive. Place them so that they acquire exceptional skill with weapons and in horsemanship. Give them a country which is eminently suited to the tactics of the hunter, the marksman, and the rider. Then, finally, put a fine temper upon the military qualities by a strong Old Testament Calvinist religion and an ardent, consuming patriotism. Combined all these qualities and all these impulses in one individual, and you have the modern Boer, the most formidable antagonist who ever crossed the path of Imperial Britain. Our military history has largely consisted in our conflicts with France, but Napoleon and all his veterans have never treated us so roughly as these hard-bitten farmers with their ancient theology and their inconveniently modern rifles. So that was what the British had to say during the Anglo-Boer War about the Boers. And of course, you take the kind of training we had in the Southern Defence Force. It was not for weaklings. We had conscription. We all had to go through it. It was tough training. It was really hard training. And I must say, having heard what my brother went through in the Rhodesian Army, it was tougher than the Rhodesian Army's training, much tougher and much more demanding. And the South African Army was extremely demanding on its physical fitness, on its weapons training, the marksmanship, the whole lot. And then you look at this little equipment we carried on the border, and you compare it to what American and British troops carry around the field. I mean, yeah, they've got body armor and all. We didn't have any of the things that they had. We didn't have the night scopes and all this sort of equipment. We didn't have the kind of support structures. We were expected to get out there in the bush and outwit the enemy and get behind them and walk into enemy territory, take on the bases and destroy them, even when we were outnumbered. Even when we were greatly outnumbered, we were expected to go in and win. And then you take those sort of people, they're running farms and savage areas. The average person in Rhodesia and South Africa were brought up in conditions that the average hampered Westerner cannot even understand. And so for us, the bush and conflict, and it's normal, it's part of our history and it's part of our heritage. And so the average South African is more ready. My wife, who was brought up in Austria, she says, you know, the people in Europe and America could never handle what we go through in South Africa. She says the average South African just gets on with things. They make a plan. And, you know, we've got water rationing in Cape Town right now. We've got very serious droughts. We've got all kinds of government nonsense. And we just make a plan. I mean, the average South African just gets on with life and incredibly resourceful. And, of course, now our young people, I've got two young sons, who are too male and too pale to get any jobs anywhere around with any of these companies because of black economic empowerment, affirmative action, and all the rest of it, BEE. And but what do? The whites are out there making initiatives, starting their own enterprises, incredibly creative, and having to, by their wits and skill and work ethic, achieve what all the laws are set to crush them. And yes, so I think if you take a farm in South Africa, the farmers that we have left in South Africa are some of the most hardy, tough, resourceful farmers on the planet. Any country would be blessed to have farmers like these. And I mean, these are the toughest because, you know, anyone else would have left for good reason by now. So yes, I think it's a privilege to be a South African, and it's a wonderful challenge, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else because we are going to see these communists lose and fail, and we're going to see them defeated, and they're going to collapse. And just like when Mugabe went down, even their supporters are going to be dancing in the streets when they see the end of the cancer, the ANC.
Dr. Hammond, could we talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Because that was the culmination of the lies. The lies led to that. And I'd like to talk about that.
The TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it immediately reminds me of 1984, George Orwell, where the Ministry of Truth dealt in lies. They were called Mini-Truth, the Ministry of Truth. And, you know, this is, in fact, what is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the exact opposite. There was no truth, and there was no reconciliation. It was psyops, psychological warfare. Now, in the military, I was in the infantry in my national service. But later on, I did get transferred to intelligence. And in intelligence, we learned how psyops is done. Now, there is psychological warfare, or comops, they'd call it. A psyops own forces, where you build up the morale of your people. There's psyops enemy forces, where you break down the morale of the enemy forces. And there's psyops local population, where you seek to win the hearts and minds of the people, or the muddle in the middle. Now, TRC is classic psyops. It was to break down the morale of the whites, and it was to build up the morale of the ANC supporters, and it was to win over people in the middle who didn't have a side, to say, oh, I had no idea such terrible things were happening. Oh, that was terrible. Oh, apartheid was horrible. And oh, how lucky we are to have the ANC and St. Nelson Mandela giving us the Rainbow Nation, and we all can live happily ever after. Now, what most people miss is this is exactly what the French Revolution had, exactly with the show trials of Stalin and the Soviet Union. This is classic communism. This is what Mao Zedong did, where he would have all the bourgeois and all the landowners brought humbled in front of people standing on a box, and then after he's made confessions, then they have him executed. And this is what happened. If you've read the Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens' French Revolution, this is the Truth and Reconciliation Committee is just another name for the Revolutionary Council, who had the bourgeois and the nobles brought there and had them confess to crimes they never did and then have them killed. And in fact, this is actually kind of funny amidst a horrible subject, but you know that in Stalin's show trials, all of the people they accused, who were great party faithfuls, would stand up and plead guilty and ask for the party to condemn them to death and pledge undying loyalty to His Excellency, the chairman, Joseph Stalin. And only in a communist country could you get people actually pleading guilty, dying with Viva Castro and Viva the Revolution and so on, which happened to General Aurelio Sanjay, the man who was in charge of the Cuban armed forces, in fact, all communist forces in Angola. He was one of Fidel Castro's buddies, one of his original 11 that were part of the original attempt to invade Cuba and so on. Well, he gets put on trial in Cuba, pleads guilty to losing the war against the fascist, imperialist, colonialist running dogs of the apartheid South Africa regime. And he asks for the death penalty to be imposed on himself, and he pledges undying loyalty to Fidel Castro and the Communist Party of Cuba. When people try to say that the Cubans won the war in Angola, we say, well, you don't tend to execute the winner of the leader of the winning army. People get executed because they failed, you know, like Star Wars. Darth Vader kills the general who's just lost the battle. You know, that's the sort of scenario. Right, TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They lost the war, and to provide themselves some legitimacy, they had the PSYOPs, and they chose Desmond Tutu, who was a political priest, if there ever was one, and who was nothing but a liberation theologian, a Marxist in religious disguise. And of course, what does he do? He releases the terrorists to kill the people in St. James Church in the St. James Massacre. He releases them from prison, but he locks up a policeman who was just doing his duty. You know, the insanity. And then you get one of the finest men of the Conservative Party, who was one of the finest English speakers, who gets blamed for the killing of Chris Hani, the head of Mkhonto we says with the terrorist wing, and he never gets released from prison. They keep him into his dying days. And, you know, this just shows how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wasn't equal, because if it was equal, you don't hand out speeding tickets at the Grand Prix. In a war, you can't prosecute some and release others. It's just not right. I mean, a war, of course, there's going to be killing done on both sides. So, for example, this is like the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials, or tribunals, was just a propaganda psyops, another Stalin show trial. They broke every rule of evidence, they broke every rule of law, and they produced law ex post facto in order to prosecute Germans of things that the Allies, were guilty of themselves. And, you know, things like bombing cities. Well, nobody bombed cities more than Allies. And I mean, they killed 2 million civilians just in Germany alone in the carpet bombing and so on. And there they were prosecuting Germans for crimes that everyone knew the Soviets had done. And they think, but you've got a Soviet marshal on the justice bench who was personally involved in the Katyn Forest Massacre, which we've been condemned for. And it's like, yeah, it doesn't matter. You know, we're the victors and we are determining justice. Well, it's not justice at all. And so the Nuremberg trials is one of the worst trials probably in the history of the world. And it was just hangman's justice, kangaroo court. It was victors' revenge and vengeance for having lost so many battles against the best army in the world, and that the Allies had to resort to terror tactics of bombing cities, starving civilians, and now at the end they take, in many cases, brave men who did their duty and hanged them. Didn't even give them a soldier's death of firing squad. So that's, in fact, do you know that both Roosevelt and Churchill didn't want a Nuremberg trial because it would open them up to the counter-accusation saying, well, you did the same and you did worse yourselves. And so they didn't want it. But Stalin insisted on the show trials. And of course, it was total communist TRC psyops, because he used to have the show trials of anyone that crossed him, have them stand on trial, except in their case, they were able to torture them to the point where they would say, I'm guilty of impossible things that they couldn't have done, and plead for the death penalty on themselves and say, long live the comrade chairman. But of course, the Germans were made of tougher stuff, and none of them folded, and none of them made such confessions, and none of them groveled like they wanted. So they had the grim satisfaction of hanging their enemies, but their enemies went to the gallows with straight backs and courageously. Now, sadly, in South Africa, we had some people cooperating with the TRC. We had some people confessing things that in a war, you've got to fight terrorism. I mean, how was it wrong to assassinate a terrorist who's planting car bombs in our cities like in Church Street? And I was just astounded at how they took some of the most innocent and obvious and normal things that a policeman does or a soldier does and try to turn it into something sinister. Whereas the context is everything. Context. If somebody's seen the Dirty Harry police movies of Clint Eastwood, if you just took a picture, a scene where the detective inspector's shooting a man in the leg in the middle of a football field and then standing on his wounded leg and crushing it while he screams in agony, you would say police brutality. But when you know the context, that that man's a kidnapper and there's a young girl who's running out of oxygen, buried in a place with limited air, and she's got literally just a few hours to live, now you understand why the policemen may have been using these extreme measures, which, however unpleasant, makes sense if you know the context. Now, this is what they want to take out. They want to make out that one day some evil person woke up in South Africa and said, I know what, let's institute apartheid to make the lives of blacks miserable. And in fact, they're missing the context. The context is nothing of the sort. The context is people from Europe came to Africa and found a basically empty and depopulated land and settled it and turned the wilderness into a garden in cases like Franschhoek. And they kept migrating, and in the late 1700s, more than 150 years after they'd arrived in the Cape, they encountered black people on the Fish River about 1,000 kilometers from Cape Town. And that was the Xhosa who were moving down. So the blacks were migrating into South Africa from the north as whites were migrating into South Africa from the south. And the whites tried to trade and have good treaties with them, but then the Xhosa started raiding their cattle, burning their homesteads, murdering their people, including their children, grandmothers, and so on. And so, some people tend to get a little unhappy about this sort of thing for some strange reason. And you have people like Piet Retief, who leaves his rifles outside the kraal because the Zulu king Dingaan asked him to, and then promptly sees his son and 100 of his followers tortured to death, and he gets his head knocked out, even while he's got the treaty of the ceding of Natal to him that he has traded and negotiated for. And the Boers then, who are banked out in the open on the banks of the Bushbank River and Blokrans River, they suddenly get attacked by 10,000 Zulus who murder hundreds of Boer women and children. Some of these dear women had 80 stab wounds from assegais in them. Some survived with 20 and more assegai wounds. Kids were bayoneted. I mean, it was horrible. Now they have the counter with the Battle of Blood River and so on. These are the context. We need to understand the context. And when we understand how these farmers who only wanted to be good neighbors and good Christians and to be kind to the local people and share the gospel with them and give them medicine and double their life expectancies, were forced to find ways to defend themselves. Then the British treated them extremely badly with the Anglo-Boer War, burned 30,000 farms down, murdered, massacred the livestock, vast amounts. Hundreds of thousands, even millions of cattle and sheep were killed in Anglo-Boer War. The destruction of homesteads, dynamiting of wells, and the killing of women and children in concentration camps. 6 women and children died for every one Boer who died in the Anglo-Boer War. I mean, what kind of war is it where you have 6 times more civilian casualties? The British Empire was really brutal in seizing the gold and diamonds of the Transvaal and Orange Free State. Well, when you consider this context, and then you consider the Cold War, the Soviet Union, communism, terrorism, landmines, limpet mines, Soviet submarines around the Cape of Good Hope, you've got car bombs in our streets. Well, naturally, there was a suppression of communism act Internal Security Act. Of course, what country wouldn't have something? America has the Patriot Act in response to Islamic terrorist attacks on America. Well, we had anti-terrorist attacks too. We weren't trying to beat down the blacks. We were trying to lift them up. In fact, that's what Henry Ford did. He lifted the black people up, massively increased their literacy, their life expectancies, their standards of living in everywhere, was building them hospitals, universities, schools, sports stadiums, incredible things. And in fact, bluntly speaking, the blacks often had better facilities than we did, many times. You can go to some of the beach resorts that were built for the coloreds and the blacks on False Bay, and it looks better than what we have at Muizenberg. Seriously. I mean, there's nothing inferior about their facilities or beaches, although sometimes they didn't maintain them well, but that's not the fault of the ones who built it and paid for it. So apartheid cannot be understood except for the context of intertribal genocide, savagery, massacres, cannibalism, and a whole lot of other evil things that were going on beforehand. Neither can you understand apartheid without understanding what blacks were doing throughout Africa as Europe retreated, such as the Simbas massacring nuns and Christians and colonialists in the Congo, such as the raping of nuns in the Congo, or the Mau Mau massacring of farmers in Kenya, and so on. And then the terrorist attacks of Frelimo in Mozambique. These are facts. The terrorist attacks and murdering of Christians in Rhodesia, murdering of missionaries in Rhodesia, these are reasons why there was an attempt to prevent it happening here, and it only made sense. It's not evil. The white people in South Africa are not innately evil. In fact, the white people in South Africa have probably done more to help black people than all the liberals of America and Europe combined. We've actually helped people. And here's another fact. Under Hendrik Verwoerd, in the time that he was Prime Minister, South Africa put 10 times more money into building up black homelands and states than all of Europe and America and the United Nations combined put into the whole of black Africa with their foreign aid. We did 10 times more for our blacks than Europe and America combined did for all of Africa. And you know, our resources were very few and our numbers were very, 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 very few. And yet the facts are, we white South Africans, far from being the most racist, anti-black people on the planet, are probably the people who've practically helped black people more than all the liberals of Europe and America combined.
We've said that very often on our show, Dr. Hammond, that in South Africa, your servant is one of the family. You are responsible for their housing, their uniforms, their food, their children, especially on farms, the education of their children, etc. And yet the South African farmer is accused of such terrible things. If people only knew that generations of farmers and generations of workers live on that farm together. They sort of inherited from each other the job and the employee. They work there forever. They have their family. They even often have the same name. They took the name of their original employer. So this reputation we have for being such murderous, terrible people is just total nonsense. And yet, how do we turn the perception of that around?
Well, certainly by programs like this, writing the truth, getting the facts out there, we must. And I'm inspired by Eastern Europe, by the candle. In Eastern Europe, they used the candle for the Leipzig prayer meeting. It was a symbol of bringing down the Berlin Wall and Iron Curtain. And the logic was, not all the darkness can put out the smallest light. Our little candle is still more powerful than all your darkness. And so there was this, and they would come to the meetings and there'd be one candle and they'd light and the candles would spread. And people would put a candle in the window and put all lights off in the home. And you just saw going around East Germany, these lights, little candles there. And it was a silent protest against the communist indoctrination and the lies. And I think we can do this. We have got to let people know that, you know, the farmers in South Africa, they're people like Angus Buchan. And they're the kind of people who do everything they can to help their farmers. As you say, now, I was brought up in a non-Christian secular family, so it was a bit of a shock to me when I came to South Africa and saw how Christian the South Africans were. For example, you go to a farm and book a fut, get the book. So they bring the book, and then the servants are called in, and they gather in the dining room, as the father or the grandfather in the family reads the Bible. And they were part of the prayer and in many cases sing a psalm. And you could see so many of these farms where there was a love between the employees. For example, the average farmer would have presents for all of his employees and their family members on the farm. They would organize special food for them. They would do, they often would even hire a school teacher, build a school for their children on the farm. Sometimes they'd build a church and organize for some pastor evangelist to come in and minister to people spiritually. They would pay for the medical bills. Now, these are things people don't look at. They might look at look at the minimum wage that these farmers have been paid. Yes, but have you considered the food they're getting? They're not paying rents. They're not paying electricity. They're getting their plumbing free. They're getting medical paid for. They're getting education. Basically, the farmers helping them on every level. And you can't just look at the money. You've got to look at the total package they're getting. In fact, they're better off than the employees of a lot of Anglo-American companies out there when you look at real term. But just something else that helped me to understand the difference between apartheid and what we have today. I'm not from a mining background, but I have been on some mines and they've explained to me how it used to work. And you walk into these, and it was phenomenal how well they built it. The old mines under the Verwoerd era and so on, they had compounds which were like whole entertainment units. They had their compounds by tribe. So the Madibili would have their tribe, the Shona would have their tribe, and so on. And they had their bioscope, their cinema, they had their halls, they had their open amphitheater where they had their plays and their dances and the different things they do. They had their church or chapel. There was all sorts of things. They had their swimming pool, they had their gymnasium. I mean, it was really quite amazing. And the proof that this was good is how these blacks would walk from Malawi. They would walk from the Congo to come to South Africa to work on the mines because they could get unimaginable wealth from work in the mines. Now, some people, they didn't like the price, but bear in mind how the cost of living was different at that stage. And these people, they thought it was worth walking 1,000 kilometers or more for this job. Now, the way they operated was they all got meat every day. They got really good food. They were fed super well. They had medical checkups. They had everything that they could ask for. And every month, a portion of the salary was taken back to the village by a representative of the mine and given to the family. A certain portion went to the government for tax and to the chief, and then a nice huge amount came to the wife. The wife or wives, in many cases, and children were well provided for while the man's working on the mines. Now, at the end of his time, they had him as building society, because we had building societies then, which gained interest. He had his building society book, which had all the money he'd earned there. Now, I mean, his family's been supported this whole time. Now, he's now got a lot of, now they're going to help him too, so that he can buy the things he wants. He wants a suit. He wants leather shoes. He wants a nice belt. He wants FM radio, shortwave and so on radio. And he wants a bicycle or motorbike. And whatever it is that this man wants, they help him to buy it. And he's still got his building society book, and he's got all his money saved up. He goes back to his village. They help with transport back. He doesn't have to walk back to his village. And I mean, these people, they were just like, the mines made us. And by the way, many of them went back to the gospel. Many times I've been to a place in Mozambique and I find there's a church there, and I say, how did the church come here? Mozambique was a very closed country. No, so-and-so went as a mine worker in Johannesburg. He came back with a Bible and the gospel. He opened up a church here and so on. Oh, that's often. That's not exceptional. That's often. So South Africa was a blessing to all of Africa from how they operate. Well, at the same time, bleeding heart liberals like Helen Suzman of the Progressive Party were whinging and whining in Parliament over, it's so patronizing, and how can you be acting like these black people don't know how to look after their money? You know, you should give them all their money on payday, and that's it. And so by pressure from around the world, South Africa stopped this paternalistic way of caring for the family and providing for the family while he's working and entering his money into savings book and so on and so forth. And they gave them all the money. And then gone. Vice, prostitutes, drunkenness, drugs, gambling. I mean, you name it. And the guys have nothing left. They don't go home. Their family's starving. There's nobody looking after them. The chief and the village die out because there's nothing coming there. Their community and the country don't get the money they used to get. It all has suddenly bred a whole industry of vice around these mines suddenly, which used to be in places where they were having tribal songs, dances, and listening to the gospel and watching some edifying films. Now it's just cesspools of shebeens and crime and violence, and this man's probably picked up another wife in Johannesburg, and he no longer cares for pride to his own wife back there. I'm just abbreviating it. This story has been multiplied over hundreds of thousands of times. This is a case where the compassions of the wicked are cruel, where the people who claim to care for the poor don't understand them, like we who've been brought up in Africa. They don't understand the witchcraft, they don't understand the polygamy, they don't understand the mentality of don't think about tomorrow, just deal with today. And so this idea of saving up and all, it's a catastrophe. The destruction of families and tribes and the rural areas by this change of policy, and I'm just talking about the mines here, and this could be replicated in other areas of the country, but when they got rid of the apartheid laws that were there to protect the black people, in many cases to protect them from exploitation from whites. And so the apartheid laws were there more to protect the black people than to protect the white people. And blacks, I've had black older people saying, we were better off under Verwoerd. We were safer under Verwoerd. We had a high standard of living under Verwoerd, or Ian Smith, as the case may be. And this may not be what the West wants to hear, but it's the truth. And I was in Europe recently having people in Belgium trying to tell me about the evils of colonialism. And I just say to them, isn't this interesting? From your perspective, you are so righteous, and you can pat yourselves on the back because you're not like your evil great-grandparents who supported colonialism. But I said, actually, the reality is reversed. Your great-grandparents, through colonialism, raised living standards in Africa, brought peace to a continent torn apart by intertribal genocidal wars, ended the slave trade, brought hospitals, schools, dams, roads, railways, the gospel, literacy, trebled the life expectancy of the people, enabled them to survive droughts. Your great-grandparents and other ancestors in supporting colonialism helped black people in Africa. But you, in your generation, have supported decolonialism and have supported the IMF, UN, United Nations and World Food Programme, UNICEF, and European Union and all the rest, Oxfam and so on, supporting the mass murdering dictators and thugs like Robert Mugabe, who have been butchering their people and impoverishing the people and halving their life expectancies. Now, really and truly, who's the righteous one? You patting yourself on the back that you are the ones who care about the poor and the blacks, whereas actually what you've done is increase their suffering, and you have immeasurably worsened their lives in every measurable way. Whereas the people you damned to hell, the colonials, actually did something good for them. And I'd say that colonialism was probably one of the best things that ever happened to Africa, and decolonialism was certainly the worst thing that ever happened to Africa. And the people who are evil are not your great-grandparents that you're damning, but you who are enabling unelected mass-murdering dictators in Africa to stay in power as they loot and abuse and rape their people in their continent. And by the way, massacre whole herds of elephants with helicopter gunships and rocket launchers. No, I mean, why don't we get a life and get the truth and face the facts and stop deluding ourselves and stop patting ourselves on the back and liberals on the head as though they're doing something good? They are enabling abuse. This is like the abused woman who wants to blame herself for her husband's abuse. You know, what we've got right now is we've got a bunch of people out there who are deluding themselves that they're on the side of justice and on the side of the poor. Actually, look at a person like Mugabe. Robert Mugabe says, I care for the poor, and he's one of the most wealthy people on the planet, and he's been making his people the most impoverished people on the planet with the worst inflation in the history of the world, the worst ecological disasters, destroying whole forests, wiping out whole game reserves for no other reason than he can, and supporting China sends them tanks and helicopter gunships while he sends them ivory. While ivory is meant to be on a moratorium, you're not meant to be selling ivory, not meant to be killing elephants. He does it. Do the liberals say anything about the Mugabes of this world or the Mobutu Sese Sekus? No, they don't, because they're hypocrites. I don't believe these liberals when they say they care for the poor and they care for the blacks and that they care for the elephants and that they care for the rhino. I don't believe any of it. I think they're a bunch of pathological liars who are lying to themselves, especially because they are acting like we care about the poor. The people who care about the poor are the white farmers who are giving them jobs, who are feeding them and clothing them and educating their children and caring for their children's medical care. In fact, the reality is exactly the opposite of what they're putting. I think they've made light darkness, darkness light, sweet bitter and bittersweet. It's a time for truth to be told in the world. And the truth is the liberals are lying and the socialists are stealing from the people And the people who are meant to be exploiting them, the farmers, are the ones who are actually helping them. In fact, they're feeding them.
Sure. Dr. Hammond, we have about 10 minutes left, and I would like you now to address Ramaphosa, because this is where South Africa is going. I'd like to talk about that in our closing moments.
Cyril Ramaphosa is a billionaire. Now, that's interesting because he wasn't a rich person in 1990, but he's become a billionaire by black economic empowerment. Now, it's not from work. Some people call him a businessman. Well, you know, if he's a businessman, I suppose you could say that that made Joseph Stalin a civil servant or something. No, he's not a businessman. What black economic empowerment South Africa was that the government insisted by law that companies that had been built up by sacrifice and hard work had to hand 51% of the shares over to the ANC to distribute amongst their comrades. And so they suddenly got dividends and wealth from what they'd never invested in. Now, normally people get shares who've invested in the company or done something. These people did nothing except organize stayaways, sabotage, riots, and burnings and go-slows and so on. So Cyril Ramaphosa is wealthy because of corruption. Black economic empowerment, affirmative action is nothing but a cover for massive corruption on a colossal scale. Think looting an entire country. So Cyril Ramaphosa was in charge of the Constitutional Convention, is chairman of it. So the constitution we've got with all of its positives and negatives are his fault. And Ramaphosa, of course, made sure that abortion was legalized. Sodomy, homosexual rights is written into the constitution. Can you believe it? The first constitution to put the right for perversion into the privileges for perverts, I call it. No gay rights whatsoever. They always had the same rights anyone else did. Right to life, right to vote, equality before the law, but they wanted privileges. They wanted special rights. And so I call it privileges for perverts. Cyril Ramaphosa is a vendor, so he's not a causer like Mandela or Mbeki. He's not a Zulu like Zuma. But he's a Vendan, which is a minority tribe, but it's a tribe that's been heavily affected by witchcraft. And I don't know how much that could have influenced him. He can act Christian amongst the Christians. He can be communist amongst the communists. He's a chameleon. He's a political chameleon. And many people say, oh, but he's more intelligent than Zuma, possibly, most probably. But an intelligent enemy is not necessarily the best enemy you want. I prefer an incompetent, arrogant enemy personally to a competent one. And for example, as a missionary who's done a lot of Bible smuggling, I preferred Frelimo to the Stasi. The Stasi of East Germany were efficient. The last thing you want is an efficient enemy. Smuggling through Checkpoint Charlie was nerve-wracking, to put it mildly. I much preferred running rings around the incompetent, lazy Frelimo in Mozambique than the efficient Stasi in Germany. So Cyril Ramaphosa, you may think, I mean, basically everything said about him is dishonest. He's not a businessman. He isn't somebody who is investing in the good of the country. For example, one example, you've heard about the Marikana mine massacre. So the situation is Ramaphosa was involved on all sides. Now, he's a major shareholder of the company, of the mine, from affirmative action. He's also a senior member of the ANC party. He was also running a private company, which enriches him, that was doing the hiring, firing, and paying, and everything else connected to personnel of the mine workers. Now, the mine workers were, he also owned the trade union that was representing the miners' interests. So talk about conflict of interest. So here the miners were protesting. They wanted a livable wage. I think they were getting 4,800, something like that, and they wanted 5,600, something like that rand a month. Actually, the mines were already paying them over 10,000 rand a month, each of them. But they're paying it to Cyril Ramaphosa's company, who was doing the bookkeeping personnel work of the mine. And they were giving the miners less than half of the money allocated for each miner and keeping the rest for themselves. They were giving the miners less than half of the salary allocated for each. So Cyril Ramaphosa and his company could have just given the mine workers the extra amount they wanted for their salary without any problem. It's not that the mine had to increase the salaries. The mine was already giving them double what they were being paid. It was Cyril Ramaphosa's private company that was defrauding them and enriching themselves. You don't get to be a billionaire by being super charitable, I guess, if you understand. So here's Cyril Ramaphosa. He's running the trade union that's organizing the riots and demonstrations. He's the major shareholder of the mine. He's the main one responsible for the personnel company that's keeping back more than half their wages anyway. And he's part of the government that orders the police to go and shoot them. Now, is this a scandal or is this a scandal? Why are investigative journalists not bringing these sort of things out? Because you would have thought this is interesting, this is intriguing, this is disgusting, it's scandalous, it's criminal, it's everything that should be part of a 60 minutes expose or something on any decent investigative journalism TV program or newspaper. And yet for some reason, you've got these liberal cowards who are unwilling to expose what needs to be exposed. We need more truth tellers to be able to shine the light. I mean, Jesus said you'll know the truth and the truth will set you free. I think if people knew the truth about the criminals that are governing us is probably the wrong word, exploiting us, oppressing us, pretending to rule us. But yes, so I don't expect Cyril Ramaphosa to be an improvement.
Yeah, sad but true. Sad but true, Dr. Hammond. The way forward is actually 10 steps back, and probably worse because he's more intelligent. He doesn't say 11 million and 5, you know. He knows how to pronounce a number. So it's probably more dangerous. If there's anything left for him to loot, it will be looted. We need secession. We need good hope. We need a place for the whites and the coloreds and the Khoisan to make a flourishing country again. And that is the bottom line here. I'm afraid we kind of come to the end of our time, and I'm sorry about that because I could talk to you for another 4 hours and still not be done. Thank you so much, Dr. Hammond, for giving us this time. And I'd love to have you back again because this is fascinating.
Thank you. Well, we out here, our mission is very active all over South Africa and Southern Africa. And if people want documentation of some of the outrageous things I just said, they can go onto our website, frontlinemissionsa.org, frontlinemissionsa or southafrica.org. And also on social media, they'll find Frontline Fellowship and Africa Christian Action as well. We've got a number of different ministries that we're operating under. And one of the reasons is because we know that there's always the danger of the communists trying to shut us down. So we try to have more arms than an octopus so that it would get confusing for them if they try to shut us down. We're very decentralized for that purpose.
Yeah, we're very much on a mission to do the same thing, Mel and Biggie, our producer, because every time we do a South African show, our servers come under huge attack. We have the most strange things happen with our lighting. All kinds of things happen. So we're also doing it a different way because it doesn't work the normal ways.
That's interesting you say that because Dr. James Kennedy was one of our fine friends, Dr. James Kennedy of Truths That Transform Coleridge. And he said every time he had me on the program, and back in the 80s, it was primarily about South Africa. And he said they never got more complaints than when they had me on and they dealt with South Africa. So you can see there's a real hatred. And I think that the real core, when you get down to it, it's not just that they hate whites and that they hate South Africa. It's they hate God and they hate Christianity and they hate Christian civilization. They hate everything we stand for. And they hate the fact that just about everything good in this world was built by Christian forefathers of ours. And they are such failures themselves. And I think the communists just loathe us because they hate the darkness. And those who hate God love death.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that's a fine note to end on, Dr. Hammond. Thank you so very, very much.
It's a great pleasure. God bless you. And let's stand firm. We're fighting the same enemies, whether your side of the Atlantic or ours.
Yes, indeed we are. The global enemy. We were very aware of that. And thank you so much for your time. You've got to come back and see us again.
With great pleasure. Thank you.
Brilliant. All right, that's an end for this show. It's been great and informative as always, and we look forward to having Dr. Hammond back. But until next time, that's it from myself and Karin. We'll see you again on another episode of Stop South African Genocide. Good night.
Good night.
Humanity has been on an epic journey of discovery, learning the truth about the world we live in. New discoveries about the true origins of humanity, ancient history, free energy, as well as the systematic corruption of world governments are now on the forefront of our daily reality. Is the world headed towards destruction based on control and power? Or is an opportunity now being presented to shift and uplift into a higher consciousness? My name is Mel V, co-founder and creative director of Conscious Consumer Network, an independent broadcast network that was launched on the 1st of January 2015. In the last 3 years, Conscious Consumer Network has broadcast over 2,800 shows in multiple languages, featuring guests from across the world, whilst creating media that is aimed at the creation of a free, fair, peaceful, just, sustainable world. Conscious Consumer Network provides full training and an interactive support network for all broadcasters, and we are always looking for inspiring and educational content.
Hi, this is Lainey Liberty.
And this is Miro Siegel.
In 2018, Conscious Consumer Network has expanded to multiple broadcast locations, increasing our availability and reach across the world, remaining on the cutting edge of independent media. If we wish to create a better world, we must first create better media, geared towards real education instead of indoctrination.
You guys really are what changing the world is going to be about. It's educating kids at a grassroots level.
Having become a pillar of stability in the turbulent world of independent media, we have even more going on in 2018. Conscious Consumer Network is a publicly funded network, and we rely on all of you to keep us on the air. Show your support for independent media by donating to our 2018 Network Support Fund. Dare to seek a better world. Support independent media.